Good evening, you're watching Bizweek with me, Winston Mavor, and today we will be looking at trends currently happening in the manufacturing sector. And my guest is none other than Chipego Zulu, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Zambia Association of Manufacturers. Chipego, let's just get right into it.
All right.
What are some of the trends that have been going on in the manufacturing sector that are currently, worth noting?
Well, of course, I think we're always talking about Proudly Zambian. Earlier this year, you heard the Minister of Commerce giving a ministerial statement talking about the usage of the Proudly Zambian logo. Now, as the sole issuers and implementers of the actual campaign, that's the Zambia Association of Manufacturers, we've been working really hard to get the logo onto the market. So what it's about, Wenson, is really one logo that will signify that this is a quality Zambian product. And when we're talking about quality, it means our manufacturers and our service providers actually will have an opportunity to utilize this one logo that's talking about great Zambian products. And, it's a whole process. We're working with, of course, the Bureau of Standards, the Metrology Agency, the Compulsory Standards Agency, Competition and Consumer Protection. All of these various stakeholders coming together under the umbrella of Ministry of Commerce, Trade and Industry, working with private sector to make sure that our consumers have access to the best products on the market. And of course, they're Zambian.
Okay, yeah. So, you've talked about this, Proudly Zambian campaign, which has been going on for a while. Mm-hmm. And obviously, what I would love to find out is this a law at the moment? Or if not, would it be any different if it was enacted into law?
See, the thing about the logo usage itself, yes, that requires a statutory instrument to actually be issued to say that completely now no other logos on the market saying Proudly Zambian. And we have been working, of course, with our line ministry to make sure that that's actually the case. I think what we're trying to promote is one way of identifying a Zambian product that is of high quality. And so for our stakeholders out there, we know we're given a grace period until September. So for now, people can still utilize the other logos. But the idea is let's begin to phase out. And by October, we will open for registration and vetting of our producers and our service providers, a 3-month period right the way through. So January, you can expect to see the brand new logo. It's patented. And, it's just a symbol of quality and trusted product on the Zambian market.
Okay. One other thing is the issue of shelf space.
Yep.
In most of these supermarkets and chain stores. Will these products help locally manufactured products to be able to have shelf space?
So the interesting thing about the logo is it does a number of different things. When we're talking about market access, first of all, we will have then a very comprehensive list of all the products on the Zambian market that meet the regulations and the standards, not only here, but even international standards as well. And that gives us a new platform if you're talking about incentives for market access, be it in our chain stores. We'll be able to say, look, these are the quality Zambian products. And of course, we're expecting our consumers to respond accordingly by buying local. And when we talk to the chain stores, we'll say, well, these are the products on demand. They must be on the shelves. So it's a campaign that works in a number of different ways. And of course, outside of the chain stores, we'll also be encouraging our colleagues from the various government agencies, for example, the electricity company, for example, might want to use a lot more Zambian products. And even when we come to the mining sector, it's really an opportunity for Zambian products to be consumed in mass. And because we're able to identify and say that these are vetted and approved, accredited manufacturers and service providers, it makes it that much easier. So there's a huge incentive actually for accessing the logo.
I love the fact that you've brought out the issue of market access, and when you look at Zambia being a net importer of South African various products, will we see a change in terms of market access, which has been a challenge, of course, for Zambian products to be able to penetrate the South African market, where we get quite a lot of commodities?
Yeah, I think there's always a lot of work that goes into. There's a lot of mechanisms that have to come into play. But definitely when you have one sort of way of communicating about your products, it's a national product. So basically everything that we'll be doing, we'll say this is a Proudly Zambian product, this is a Proudly Zambian service. You can sell that on a domestic market, you can sell that in a regional market, you can sell it in an international market. So it actually creates a different level of operation for our producers, for our service providers. And of course that must be coupled with the necessary policy support to make sure that we're still competitive even when we have this logo that is saying we have quality products.
Now, recently, the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa was in the country for a day's work visit, and one of the things that rings in my mind is the issue of the trade imbalance.
Yep.
So, from a manufacturing perspective, what could be done to balance trade between these two friendly countries?
Of course, I think we've had this very long discussion with South Africa, and it's become very clear that we're hardly getting our Zambian products across to the South African market. So again, with a campaign such as the Proudly Zambian campaign, where we're able to demonstrate that these products meet international standards, for example, it becomes a much easier conversation when you're talking about trade between South Africa and Zambia. I think we've been trying to make quite a bit of headway, especially with, look, for example, chain stores from South Africa have been operating in Zambia for a while, and you're starting to see more and more Zambian products featuring on their shelves. It's been a struggle. It's been very hard work, but I think with our campaign, a national campaign, we'll actually be able to put a lot more of our products into the South African market and our services.
Okay. Yeah. Now, I am aware that, Zambia's, industry titan, okay, if I would call it that way, Trade Kings, has actually been making frantic efforts to ensure that they gain ground and penetrate the South African market and also the manufacturing sector at large. Now, what is being done to be able to ensure that, small manufacturers from here would ultimately benefit, from such a progressive, attempt by Trade Kings?
Okay. Directly in relation to Trade Kings?
not necessarily, but just generally. I mean, okay. it's like the issue of what this market that is difficult to penetrate.
Yes.
Here's one person that just goes there, makes headway. So
yeah.
what benefit?
I think when we're talking about our SMEs, there are obviously a lot of opportunities to really pick them up and help them to grow into these industry giants that we're seeing, such as Trade Kings. From a ZAM perspective, obviously, one of the things we're trying to deal with is the whole financial situation. So we are trying to put in place some interesting collaborations over the course of the next quarter, where we want to talk about SME development and really accessing finance, and not at those high interest rates. We're looking at different types of models of supporting SME growth. So we're excited about that, and we're really keen to roll it out. I think what we all want to see is a number of small-scale manufacturers becoming medium, becoming large, getting into these larger markets as well, and so that we're able to supply beyond Zambia, and we're able to bring that money back home and stimulate the economy, which is what we need at the moment.
You have brought out one of the most critical issues, which is the issue of money, the issue of capital, and the issue of classification of SMEs. Do you engage, for example, the financial sector to ensure that specific products are developed for these SMEs that have the potential, to become significant players in the manufacturing sector? Is that effort being done from your part?
Okay, so I think we have definitely we've made a number of strides this year. I think what we started off with was our training for SMEs in financial and product management, and out of that we actually got into a number of different discussions with different stakeholders in the financial sector, not only banking institutions actually, but other sort of partners coming in on board, talking about equity partnerships, joint ventures, and these are the sorts of approaches that we actually need to encourage in our SME sector, where we start to say, look, you have a great idea, you have an innovation, you don't have the capital, you have a partner who will be able to support you in this. And we've had some interesting discussions around that, where we actually have equity partners that are willing to support to a certain extent, and beyond that point they say, okay, you can buy back the shares or we can sell them to somebody else. So these are the sort of dynamics we have to get our SMEs thinking about now and preparing for. And of course, I think in September we have the World Export Development Forum coming up. And again, it's also looking at SMEs and saying, how do we develop our exports as Zambia? How do we ensure that Zambia is not left behind in this whole conversation in and around regional integration, in and around globalization as well? We definitely don't want Zambia to be left behind. And our manufacturing sector, we need to work very hard alongside our policymakers to achieve that.
Still on this thought, within the confines of the Zambian, legislation, you discover that SMEs, are classified according to the capital base. And some of the figures in there really do not reflect what is actually happening on the ground. For example, if you are going to define, let's say maybe, a micro SME, not that this is an accurate figure, but just as an example, it's somebody with a capital base of 100,000 kwacha, and yet that is not what is translating on the ground. What is your thought on that? Should that be revised?
Well, when we talk about SME policy, I think there's definitely something in the works at the moment. We have been working with, of course, our line ministry and various others, talking about how do we encourage local direct investment. And those are the sort of discussions that are actually encompassed in that. We say, look, we have to relook at how we look at SMEs in Zambia. And the same discussion comes up when we're talking about access to finance. You say, how do we make sure that we're actually able to help SMEs grow and not shun them and say, oh, no, you know what, we're not comfortable. That sort of approach. So I think there's a lot of scope for us to continue with the discussion, but of course we'd like it coupled with action to make sure that we're implementing and able to develop the sector.
Okay. Another issue that I would like to bring to your attention, this evening is the issue of the, multi-economic facility zone. And up to now, occupation of those particular areas has been a challenge, especially for local manufacturers, and local entrepreneurs at large. What do you think, where do you think is the challenge?
Okay, so this is an interesting one. I was recently in a forum where we were discussing a very similar issue. There are obviously a number of challenges with the multi-facility economic zones, and there is a need to relook at the performance to make sure that the incentives that are being offered in there are attracting the correct investment. I think whenever we're talking about multi-facility economic zones, we tend to focus on Lusaka South because that's where a majority of my members are now setting up their plants. So Lusaka South has definitely made a number of strides in encouraging local producers to set up in the multi-facility economic zone. But I think we still have a number of issues in and around the facilities themselves. Electricity supply, for example, being a key one. To say the economic zone has to have a constant supply of energy. I think that's one of the reasons why we're investing in there. Issues to do with the lease period considered as short by some, access to title deeds as well, making it a bit difficult to access finance if you're operating in the facility or in the zone. So a number of discussions in and around how do we augment, how do we change the concept slightly to make sure that it's beneficial to local producers and that it encourages them to set up in there. A great idea, I must say, and I know that Lusaka South multi-facility economic zone has definitely made a number of efforts to try and meet us halfway, and that's why you see a number of manufacturers are actually setting up in there, local manufacturers.
Lusaka East, economic zone, obviously, we've got, a Chinese, manufacturing firms that have actually set up in there. And one of the concerns that was emanating is the issue of those particular firms having to bring in, most of their inputs from China. How is that, affecting the local manufacturing potential?
Well, I think generally speaking, when we're talking about some of the larger projects in the country, we do have to begin to look at it slightly differently and say, how do we ensure that even as we are bringing in investors, we're also making sure that the local sourcing component is included in all of these sort of projects that we're setting up. If you just look generally at infrastructure or construction, for example, we do have a number of local producers on the market producing competitively international standard products. But you'll find a situation where in some of our turnkey projects, majority of that material is sourced from outside the country, even though it's available locally. So there is this discussion that needs to happen in and around the turnkey projects to say, how do we structure them to make sure that the local industry is able to feed into these particular projects and in so doing help it grow. Outside of doing that, all we are doing is creating employment in other countries, and we're creating jobs in other countries, and we're generating revenue for other countries. And I don't think that is what our aspiration is at the moment.
You talked about another interesting component, the issue of constant power supply, which is a fundamental element of, effective production. Now, ZESCO recently signed an agreement with its Malawian counterpart firm, which is ESCOM, and this is a 5-year deal that that entails ZESCO supplying power to ESCOM. What is your take on that with regards to the issue of meeting domestic domestic demand as we speak?
I remember having a discussion with ZESCO in and around this, actually, the whole issue of exporting power. And I think we always are met with a very good explanation as to why we can afford to export our power. There's downtime, there's uptime, and so on, all of these things. But generally speaking, I think when we're talking about access to a steady supply of electricity or energy for the manufacturing sector, it's very critical for the production process. We're constantly talking about, we need to increase our exports, we need to increase production locally, and a huge component in that is actually energy. And energy needs to be consistent. Outside of that, what we end up doing is shutting down in the middle of process suddenly most of the time. And what that does is we have to do rework. We lose material. We lose man hours. We lose a lot of time. So there's a lot of wastage in and around that process. So there's still, I think, a lot of engagement that is required between industry and the service provider, just to make sure that we have that consistency, so we can build the productivity and enhance competitiveness, so that we're able to compete at the end of the day.
As we wrap up this conversation, Chipago, one of the issues that is trending at the moment is the issue of, the debt refinancing and loan restructuring. What I'd like to find out from you is, as Zambia takes into consideration engaging this Turkish firm to refinance the approaching, Eurobond, what impact is the current debt situation having on the manufacturing sector?
Well, I think definitely when we're talking about debt servicing, it's coming down for manufacturing to this whole fact that we have to generate revenue, right? Revenue has to be collected in order to service the debt. And I think as industry, what has been our major contention, especially because we're in the budget process now, and we're talking about tax policy that will be able to, allow us to meet our debt servicing requirements. So in and around tax policy, we're saying, look, we need to create space for the private sector to grow, because we need to be able to have an economy that is efficient, that is, constantly growing, so that we're able to refinance, right? So from our perspective, I think there's definitely opportunity for that. I know it's a contentious kind of discussion, because you talk about, but if we reduce, let's say, corporate tax, it means that we're going to lose revenue. But I think what our assertion would be is, let's have medium to long-term perspectives. In the medium to long term, what we'll end up doing is creating a stronger base, creating even more jobs, which will in turn create more revenue, and enhancing our export base as well. All of that will feed back into this whole debt refinancing discussion that we're having. So in and around the discussion about the firm, I think I would avoid commenting on that one, but just to say that let's ensure that we have a tax policy that is responsive and allows the economy to grow. Let's not restrict it by increasing the level of taxation.
Thank you very much for coming through to Basic Chipago, and it is always a pleasure to chat with you. My name is Wenson Mavoro. You've been watching Bizweek, and today we're looking at trends happening in the manufacturing sector. And of course, quite phenomenal and significant thoughts have been shared in that regard. Make sure you catch up with Bizweek next week, as we'll be looking at other interesting topics. Good night.